Have you ever heard, like, the most watered down, just totally basic concept of a game, but it was still so brilliant that even without the details, you still knew you were super interested in it? Cause that's pretty much how I felt about Raging Loop when I first heard about it. It's werewolf or mafia, Town of Salem, I mean, they're all the same game, you get it. Anyways, it's that, but as a visual novel. You know, the whole point of visual novels is emphasizing the importance of your choices, and Werewolf is a game that, at its core, is doing the exact same thing, so this sounds like a match made in heaven, right? Like, this sounds like it could easily end up being a super cool and super unique game. And sure enough, in a year that's been full of great visual novel releases, this one still stands out to me as one of the best. PQube was kind enough to supply me with a review copy of it, so let me tell you all about it. Alright, so before I get into the meat and potatoes of this review, first I gotta go ahead and get some facts out in the open for the sake of transparency. 1. I am friends with a guy who translated this visual novel. His name is Andrew Hodgson. Online he's called Steiner, but friendship aside, I really do think that he and John Hooper did a fantastic job with this game's localization, and my opinion of this game overall is totally regardless of this. And 2. If you play this game, you might notice a few brief segments, I think there's 2 or 3, where there's a few characters speaking Middle English, and they're doing that because they're speaking 14th century Japanese in the game's original format. And Middle English was the phase that the English language was in at the time. Yeah, Old English would have been centuries before, and Shakespeare's version of English is actually considered early modern English. Fun facts. But anyways, I'm telling you this because, in case you didn't know this about me, I'm a medievalist, and Steiner knew that, and for the sake of adding a fun layer of authenticity to this game's localization, he asked me for help in translating the sentences that he translated from what would have been 14th century Japanese to modern English, but now into 14th century English. But just like before, my opinion of this game still comes totally regardless of this. I am impartial, I got all the disclaimers out of the way, so now let's go ahead and dig right into this. Originally released on iOS and Android in Japan in 2015, Raging Loop is a horror visual novel about the value of learning your local history. You play as a grad student named Haruaki Fusaishi who gets lost in the mountains after a pretty rough breakup. He ends up crashing his bike and getting rescued by a girl from a nearby village called Yasumizu, and it's suspiciously absent from the map. And yet somehow that's not even the strangest thing about Yasumizu, no, that would definitely have to be the mist that sets in almost immediately after Haruaki arrives. This mist signals the start of a dangerous ceremony in which a few villagers are secretly selected by their mountain god to kill the others in their sleep one by one. The villagers are then left with the task of figuring out who these murderous villagers are, and they're referred to as wolves, and they have a discussion called a feast every day in which they try to figure out who's a human and who's a wolf, and then they hang those who they find suspicious. So, yeah, it's like I said in the beginning of the video. Mafia, werewolf, or even Town of Salem, but now it's in visual novel form. Now, the bad news is that being one of the 4 outsiders in the village at the time, this means that Haruaki is suspicious right from the get-go, so he ends up dying a lot. But the good news is, he comes back every time and uses his experiences to make better decisions. Ultimately, he uses this weird power of his to try to solve the mystery of why this is happening and how he can save the village. The way this works is that there's a flowchart showing you all the branching paths, and you can access it at any point in the game, and from there you just select any spot you want, usually it's gonna be a big decision, and then choose something else and see where that gets ya. So, you may have noticed a couple of locks and keys floating around, and those are actually super important. So, at some points when you die, you're gonna get these keys, and they signify a particularly important piece of information that you wouldn't have been able to get at any other point. Haruaki retains his memories when he moves around the branching paths, and he calls this looping, and the idea is that you're gonna pick up keys and then use them to unlock new options for previous decisions, and then those are gonna totally change the course of the narrative. Now, honestly, I love me a visual novel with a flowchart. Personally, I think more visual novels should have them, if nothing else, just because it really helps you stay organized of where you are in the narrative and what you need to do to get to a different route. So not only do I love that Raging Loop has a flowchart just in general, but I also love that it actually uses it to help keep the game more organized and to help keep things moving along faster so you don't have to sit there and repeat the same conversations over and over again. You know, sometimes it really is the little details that end up making a big difference. But that is not the only thing I love about this game. Honestly, Raging Loop does such a good job of building building suspense and then delivering with an incredible payoff. This game's premise should already make it clear that this is a game where your decisions are going to be all about strategy and thinking things through, and oh my god, is that ever the truth. It's hard to talk about it without spoiling anything, but what I can say is this. Admittedly, yeah, the first part of the game isn't as generous about letting you choose the way things go simply because it needs time to set up the story. But the more you die and the more information you learn, the more liberal this game gets about letting you choose what to do, and by that I mean letting you choose who lives and who dies, and by extension, what happens. I think the turning point for this happening is when you start the second major loop, and it took me about 4 hours to get to that point, so not bad, but probably worth keeping in mind. That being said, when this game starts to get good, it gets really good really fast. Like when I played it, I generally played it in 3 to 4 hour chunks at a time because I was just so hooked on what was going on, and I really liked that the decisions actually felt important. And you know, while I'm talking about things that are important, let's go ahead and talk about the characters. So the village is pretty small, so by the end of the game, you're gonna get to know everyone pretty well, and luckily most of the villagers have pretty interesting backstories, so it makes this a pretty good experience. And honestly, even Yasumizu itself, actually, I think has the most interesting backstory of them all. There's a surprisingly high level of detail put into the village's backstory, and learning about it to unravel the mystery of the feasts was honestly one of the highlights for me. But Yasumizu aside, I actually think that the protag, good old Haruaki here, is definitely the most standout character for a couple of reasons. For starters, I mean, I'm gonna be real with you, it is super refreshing to have a protag who knows roughly the same amount as the player thanks to the looping mechanic. It's great. And second, he's a weird character. I can't really talk about this much in depth without spoiling anything, but what I can say is that, for better or for worse, we see a lot of different sides of Haruaki throughout this game. You know, sometimes he's great, sometimes he's awful, and sometimes he's pretty bold, and he's often at the center of many of Raging Loop's best and most memorable scenes. So yeah, if all this gushing didn't make it obvious, I think Raging Loop is a fantastic horror visual novel, and absolutely worth a try. Honestly, I have only one significant complaint about this game, and that's how rushed it feels toward the end. I don't want to spoil anything, so how can I put this? The writing throughout Raging Loop is generally pretty good. In fact, it's actually pretty great, but toward the game's ending, it does start to feel pretty rushed, and above all, it likes throwing massive info dumps at you. And it's just so much information in so little time that it's just really easy for the player to be left feeling confused about what's going on, and by extension, it makes a few really important scenes toward the game's end feel like they're coming out of nowhere. Now, in Raging Loop's defense, there is a new game plus mechanic called Revelation Mode, and it's fantastic. You get this after you beat the main game, and what it does is it lets you see some of the characters' thoughts and gives you some bonus scenes and dialogue that helps make sense of things. And like I said, I love this. I think there's some great scenes in here. However, toward the game's end, I really think it relies too heavily on Revelation Mode, because when you're just going through the game for the first time, it's way too easy to feel lost in these info dumps. There's a lot of dense lore in Raging Loop, and unfortunately, that ends up being a double-edged sword. That being said, Revelation Mode is still a super cool addition to this game and has some scenes that are just, God, you know, it is so hard for me to talk about this game's best parts without treading into spoilery territory, but suffice to say, it puts a lot of super important scenes and details of the main game into a totally new light, and it seriously enhances an already thrilling story, and that's to say nothing of how much replayability it adds to the game. It's a super creative take on a new game plus mode, and it's something I would honestly love to see more visual novels do. So to get this whole thing wrapped up, for fans of psychological horror, I would definitely recommend Raging Loop. It may not be completely perfect, but it has a lot of unique qualities that I can safely say make for a really memorable experience. If I had to score this game out of 10, I think an 8 is appropriate here. I've played a lot of visual novels, but I can say with confidence that I've never played anything quite like this, and that's a good thing. In fact, that's a great thing. And speaking of great, honestly, the cherry on top of all this is that Raging Loop is currently on Switch and PS4 for only $30. You know, for the sheer amount of content that you get, that is a steal. It's a great visual novel at a great price. Like, at this point, I really don't know what else I can tell you. Go give this game a try. It's unique, it's scary, and it's got a really funny scene where Haruaki convinces someone not to go on a suicide mission by telling them that he's gonna start flirting with their mom if they end up dying. It's great. Shout out to my boy Geoffrey Chaucer, by the way, for being a great reference for Middle English. Go read the Canterbury Tales, y'all. It's great.